Welcome back to Vancouver Carpenter. So today I'm going to take you through the process of building a fireplace surround that had a radius and 3/4 inch bullnose arches and was finished with Venetian plaster. The first thing I did was I built some basic boxes out of 2x4s, glued and screwed them to the wall to fit the rough dimensions for the framing. The hardest part about this stage is going from a finished drawing on a plan and getting all of your measurements in the right place so that by the time you finally built it, everything actually ends up where it's supposed to be. So it's just about knowing your thicknesses of drywall, accounting for corner beads, and doing all of your deductions when you're doing your layout. Next, I had to lay out the arch. So right here, I'm just finding the center of the 2x4 and creating a little notch with a knife for my pencil to sit in when I basically use the piece of wood as a compass. In this case, the arch for this design was just a simple radius, not an elliptical curve or something more complicated. And that way I didn't have to do any complicated mathematical formulas to try and create the curve. Cutting the radius is pretty simple. First, I just cut it to width, and after that, pick up the jigsaw and start cutting it out. Slow and steady. This is your template piece, so you want to do a really good job on this one. You don't want to go with the mentality that the drywall will bend and it will make up the difference of a wavy cut. This first cut is your most important one to get as perfect as you can. Next, I test fit it before using it to cut all the other ones. And I wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of extra space because by the time you end up putting everything together, things have a way of growing. So if it was very snug at first, you might end up with a piece that won't actually fit in there, which would be quite the headache. Once the customer and designer gave the green light for the radius, I could now start cutting out the other three. So be sure to only use the first one you cut as your template. Write template on it and only use that one to scribe, because what will start to happen is if you use each one you cut as your next template, you can start to get compounding error where it can literally grow as much as a pencil line each time, or the waves in your first cut get exaggerated in the second one. So by the time you are actually cutting out your third or fourth radius, they don't look anything like your original one. So be sure to only use the template to do your scribing. That way you will ensure a consistent radius. To mark the studs, I find it easiest to clamp the radius to a solid object, and then I mark them out every 4 inches. This will give you enough meat to fasten to and get the drywall to a consistent curve without snapping it very easily. I was also in no mood to start drilling pilot holes for some of the smaller pieces, so what I chose to do was pre-blunt the nails on these small bits, and then just use nails instead of screws. I kind of enjoyed every opportunity I get to use nails, by the way. I'm a little old school like that. Screws are great, they are a very good tool, they definitely hold the material tight, but when I can, I just kind of enjoy driving hand nails. Call it right there. And next we have everybody's favorite, hanging drywall. So I did this a little bit different than I usually do. I decided to pre-measure and cut as many pieces as I possibly could. So next up will be boarding the radius. And just like in the first video where I did an arch, I found that I had to soak the sheets in water to get them to bend properly. So it's 2 layers of 1/4 inch drywall. So this is 3/4 inch Trimtex bull nose corner bead, arch bead. So I like to spray the plastic bead first and then the drywall second, because the bead is plastic and the glue will stay wet on the plastic longer. The drywall, being so dry, soaks up all the adhesive, and you're waiting until they are both just tacky. You should be able to touch the glue and have it not come off on your finger, but just feel a little tacky. At which point, when you press the corner bead onto the drywall, the glue will set immediately. It is contact cement. You basically just want to make sure that you're following the contour of the radius perfectly, because you really can't correct it very much after this point. Once that bead is on there, it is in that exact location forever. So you better like where it is. In previous videos, you may have noticed I poo-pooed people for stapling their Trimtex corner beads. However, in the case of an arch bead where they have these little tabs that pop up, it's very common for those to not want to adhere well individually or as a group. So I will literally staple every single one of them, because it's much easier to staple every single one of those now than it is to start fixing all those little tabs when they pop up down the road. Trust me on this one. A little extra care and attention now will save you a lot of headache later. Another thing that I didn't mention about bullnose corner bead is you need to make sure that you leave it back a 1/2 inch. So it looks like the gaps are wide open, but if you do not leave your drywall about 1/2 inch back at least, you're going to notice that the bullnose corner bead actually won't fit. For the outside 3-way corners, I chose to use these handy dandy Trimtex adapters. I think they are pretty essential. I could not figure out how to miter these things properly, so I was really glad that I bought them. For inside corners, I made my own miter gauge out of a piece of 1.5 inch ABS that I ripped, which I then cut with a speed square and a hacksaw. So you can buy these. Trimtex does make them, but I just couldn't get one in time for this job. So overall, I was pretty happy with the results from my homemade gauge, but I would absolutely recommend, should you have the time, definitely get the Trimtex gauge. It's going to save you a lot of headache for sure. This was actually a pretty hard job. This was my first time doing 3/4 inch bullnose, and like I said, I didn't necessarily have exactly all the right tools. I was kind of under the gun. I was also joining paper-faced bead up to the Trimtex vinyl adapters, which isn't ideal, but I was just working with what I could get my hands on at the time. Also, I wish that I could make a detailed tutorial on how to do this, and maybe if I ever do another 3/4 inch bullnose job, I will. But since I was figuring this all out for the first time, I really didn't think it was appropriate to make a how-to video. Because I was joining dissimilar materials, I decided it would be best to tape the joints with fibofuse tape and taping mud. I knew that it was going to be a headache bringing back those profiles, but I thought it was going to be a lot less of a headache than fixing little hairline cracks in a Venetian plaster job. I also put mesh tape on the flange, even though I stapled it. A little insurance goes a long way. Now, if there's one thing you're going to find out about bullnose corner bead, it's not fun or easy to coat. They do make a special tool for cleaning off the edge of the bullnose corner bead, but I found whenever I used it, it just dug into it. So I would just scrape off the edge of the bead a few times with my knife. It seemed to be adequate. And another thing that was new to me on this job was I skim coated the entire thing with all-purpose heavyweight mud. There was no lightweight mud on this job. So it was a bit of a bear to sand, but I think it made the job stronger overall. And for those of you wondering how I recreated the profile over top of the taped joints, the transition, it was actually pretty easy. So I just added a bunch of mud on here. Once the other stuff had firmed up a little, I then took the tool that was meant for actually cleaning off the corner bead and just pushed it down the profile, and it did a really good job of recreating it. I also used the corner bead cleaner to add a little bit more mud onto the edge of the bullnose corner bead, because all of those little slits in the bead that help it bend, I could feel all of those with my hand. So it was a good way to add a little bit more mud cleanly over top of the profile. And in combination with a delicate sanding job, we could get a nice profile back there. So yeah, speaking of sanding, here's the Planex. It always does a nice job for me. I think I would quit drywall if I didn't have this thing. Now if I could just get the Planex to do detail sanding, then I'd really be set. Honestly, sanding this bullnose job was so much work. And like I said, the all-purpose heavyweight mud didn't make it any easier. I spent probably triple the amount of time I usually spend getting all of these details just right. And in order to keep the profile, what I made sure of was to never sand parallel to the corner bead on the edge of the bead, only on the top of the surface. So as you can see, I'm taking great pains to really follow the radius of that while sanding to ensure that I just keep that profile exactly as it is. And honestly, once it was painted, it really came out good. Although I don't know if I actually got any footage of it painted. So next up comes the plaster, and it was Marmorino KS, which is a Venetian plaster that has some sand in it. I found applying it with a 4-inch putty knife to be kind of the easiest, and here I am trying to leave it somewhat flat, but also have some texture and some movement in it, which was probably the hardest part. I'm good at making things flat, but to give an appealing texture, that's challenging. And it was especially challenging because of all these very small surfaces where it was only, say, about 2 or 3 inches before the round over. It's really hard to give it any sort of depth and body in that condition. And probably the hardest part of the whole thing was trying to apply, again, an appealing, uniform, and random texture to the curved portion of these arches. I had to use this oval-shaped trowel because if you have any sharp edges, they'll just dig in the whole time. So I think this was before I had actually figured out how to really make the pattern. And here I am with my daughter, actually, so I found it really useful to have her. This is on the first coat. I was working on the insides and she would work on the outside, because one of the other challenges of this project was you were always fighting with the edges drying out. And because the edges are round, it's not like a feature wall where you have point A to B. You're having to work over the surfaces because there's not a natural breaking point. To get up right into the corner, I found it was necessary to use a 2-inch knife because any other tools would be too big and you couldn't actually get right up to it. And it was also important to not leave any little nubs, so I'm trying to get that off without also getting stuff on the other side. So one thing about Venetian plaster that I cannot overstate is how slow and painstaking of a process it is. So I'm somebody who's used to applying a lot of material onto the wall quickly and smoothly. And this is just a totally different animal. You know, you're trying to leave a little bit of that movement, a little bit of that texture. And over the entire surface, it has to look uniform, but in the small spaces, it needs to look random. It can't look too different in one area than another. And one of the methods that I used to try and avoid having too uniform of a pattern was to make sure that I didn't have any straight lines. So you can see I'm not, taking it down to a straight 45 degree, not a straight plumb line or a straight horizontal line. Every time I was adding more of the plaster, I would just make sure to keep it a pretty random pattern because those edges have a tendency to dry out on you. This is the point where we are burnishing it. So it has set up for a while and then I'm just polishing it down. And so it's the high spots that get especially polished. So most of it has a very matte look to it and all of the high spots get that nice smooth look, which gives it a bit of depth and texture to it. Also, it doesn't look as extreme as it does in person as it does here because I believe I had the light shining from the bottom, which exaggerates all of the ridges. So when we show the finished product with regular lighting, you'll notice it looks a lot different. And speaking of finished product, here it is. The lighting in this first clip is not that good, but it almost emphasizes how soft those edges are. I think that was probably my favorite part, was how the curved edges look. And there you can see the sheen and the texture. And these parts were probably the hardest to get an appealing and uniform texture on, for sure. The small parts where you just didn't have much room to move your trowel and create that look. But yeah, I like it. You can kind of see in this clip what those corners look like. It's just got a nice organic hand-applied look to it. And here, this gives a better idea of what the texture looks like under harsh lighting. I stressed so hard about this project and I was really hard on myself during the whole process of it, but looking back at the footage now, I'd say I'm actually pretty happy and I'm glad I got to be a part of it. Definitely the most interesting thing I've ever had the pleasure to build.